Okay, I'm hope you had a good rest after this really marathon discussions, and we are close to lunch. But before lunch, we have a very interesting keynote. It's Keyu, and she is probably also the reason why we dared to organize such an event, because we thought, oh, building resilience in the age of uncertainty, will be an emerging topic, but we need some really well-known speakers. And I read her book, the New China Playbook, which I found very inspiring. And but I thought, oh, she may not be willing to join. But then she was spontaneously saying, yes, that sounds great. I'm happy to talk about the recent Chinese history and how this nation became more resilient. Unfortunately, she cannot be present now because I think her daughter has this very important exam and she has to be with her. So she's also a responsible mother. And she has a double appointment. She's a professor at the London School of Economics, but also at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And I think she will join us online. Is she there already? Great. Hello.
Hi.
Keyu. Thanks a lot for joining us online. We really appreciate it. We just had a very interesting first panel discussion. It was on resilience in terms of energy security, cybersecurity, water management security. And China was already mentioned a couple of times as an example where things went extremely fast in building up resilience. And so your talk will be very complimentary, I think, and it will be sort of the crown on top of these discussions we had in the morning. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you so much. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you, albeit virtually. I'm deeply sorry that I cannot join you in person, but I'm hoping that the substance of our discussion will be as fruitful as it should be. I want to share some observations about China. As was mentioned, that China is a topic that comes up all the time, but the deep misunderstandings about China, the Chinese economy, how it works, the model, where the projection is in the future, there's such a big gap in the understanding of what happens there that I think that any more insight will shed light on the future of China, but also vis-a-vis its relationship with the world. There's a strange economic dichotomy. I will focus a lot of the remarks on the recent events, but of course it's built on the deeper structure of the model, which I'd like to also share with you. But there's a dichotomy, a real dichotomy between the persistently weak economy, which you were reading all the time in the newspaper, under investment, under consumption, low confidence, but the remarkably fast technological growth. It is the first time in history that a developing country with only 25% of the standards of livings of the Western advanced economy is able to do the leading edge technology, sometimes even leading the biggest players, the United States, in many ways. That dichotomy between the strength of the technology and innovation and the weakness of the economy is a puzzle, but I think it does reflect a great deal of how the model works. And as you will see, resilience and robustness is a double-edged sword, or two sides of the same coin, where robustness does not necessarily mean resilience, just as China has grown so fast for so long. Again, the first time in human history, in all of human history, China has grown the fastest for the longest period of time. But of course, along with it came a lot of environmental degradation and developmental pains. However, China is firmly in a new era. Now, just a few numbers just to get us, going on the remarkable progress of the technology. It's really not just about solar panels and EVs, as you know. The arrival of, or the sudden arrival almost from nowhere of DeepSeek, challenging directly the leading edge technology companies in the United States. Huawei, NVIDIA's fiercest competitor, despite export controls and bans of all sorts, China has overcome the choke points the U.S. thought it had on China indefinitely. And that was a surprise to the world, a real shock to the world. But even biotech, I think it was Bloomberg feature that claims China's biotech advance is as ferocious as AI and EVs. Biotech, pharmaceuticals, 35% of new global oncology trials take place in China. And it was 5% only 10 years ago. 73% of global patent publications now come from China. A decade ago, it was only 45%. Of course, we're familiar with the Chinese production of world EVs and solar modules, but whether it's biologics, precision medicine, obviously AI, robotics, China is really up there in the world. And again, I just want to emphasize, it's a 10,000 per capita income country able to do the leading edge technology. So I want to try to go deeper as to why, right? And I don't want to talk about the simple things that people talk about all the time: the engineers, the number of, the scale of the economy, the market size, human capital, infrastructure. Yeah, these are just proximate factors. Are they the fundamental drivers? There are lots of big countries in the world, population size, similar development levels that are not able to do what China has done. So first of all, the closest thing that we have to say is the Chinese have got to thank President Trump. Ever since 2018, starting from the trade wars and most importantly, the export controls on advanced technology, the banning of Huawei. Huawei, by the way, faced an existential crisis, a crisis of survival after the banning of the sanctioning. Now it is alive and kicking, doing extremely well, and according to NVIDIA, is NVIDIA's biggest competitor, fiercest competitor. That would have not happened at that pace without the export controls. Of course, it was painful. It was the threat of death, but they overcame that. And the reason is as simple as it sounds, that first of all, there's a national response to the existential crisis. China really initiated a techno-nationalism that was unseen before, like the Chairman Mao's two bombs and satellite program in the 1960s. Also, Huawei put in more effort than ever before, along with lots of partners, even the former competitors like Alibaba, the tech platforms, came to collaborate with Huawei because everybody faced an existential crisis of not being able to access advanced chips. And when you have something like DeepSeek emerging, DeepSeek will sit on top of Huawei's ecosystem because there's no other choice. Chinese domestic players will choose domestic chips over foreign chips, even if they're not sanctioned, because of the uncertainty and of the lack of reliability of access to American chips. You basically got a whole country working together to overcome one nationally mobilized objective. And what is really interesting about innovation here, I want to make a contrast between Chinese style and American style innovation now and going into the future, is about efficiency and ecosystem. So this was brought to my attention that of the 1,000 times of increase in productivity, going from 25 nanometer to 5 nanometer advanced chips, only 4 times out of that 1,000 times was due to the chips itself. 250 times of that efficiency increase was due to ecosystem efficiency. And the ability for Huawei to bring about ecosystem efficiency, just like many other Chinese technologies focusing on ecosystems and how the parts fit together rather than just the advanced parts of certain segments, is a very interesting and definitive feature of the Chinese technology, and also explains why it's been able to withstand such a major shock. And I want to focus on technology and innovation because I think it is the definitive race or competition, but it also reveals a great deal about the Chinese model itself. So the second reason why Chinese economy technology has advanced so much is of the political economy model that I describe in the book, in the chapter called The Mayor Economy. The Chinese, you would think as a centralized system, that's only partially true. It is extremely politically centralized, but economically, it is very decentralized, the most decentralized form of economic models around the world. And so you basically have the local officials, whether provincial governors, city mayors, or even district chiefs today, running around the country, running around their locality, building mini Silicon Valleys for their private companies. And the whole misconception around the state suppresses the private sector doesn't have access to this and that. Well, it's not really quite accurate. It's actually quite the opposite. So the mayors, I call them the mayors, but it's really local chieftains, will facilitate the private sectors in whatever their undertaking is, whether it's to bring finance, hire talent. They're a one-stop shop. And the reason is that their incentives are aligned. They will get promoted if their economy does well. And because of local competition, you're the Zhejiang province, you're competing with your neighboring Jiangsu province, who has the more growth, who has more unicorns, who can produce a national champion like DeepSeek. So what are you going to do? Are you going to help the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, who are much less productive, or are you going to enable the Alibabas, the DeepSeeks around the world, around the country? Well, of course, the latter. So they actually go out of their way to help the private companies. And this is one very big misunderstanding. And of course, this is not all over China, but it is pretty much in a vast area of China. So there's a map that has been done, part of the research for solar panels. This beautiful illustration of how this works. In 2005, in terms of solar panel production or innovation, of course, China was a desert, complete desert. Then the industrial policies to support this industry rolled out from 5 cities to 10 cities to 15 cities to 80 cities around the country. 10 years later, you look at that map again, you see that the desert has blossomed. In all of those cities, some of which have more than 1,000 new patents per year for solar, all in those areas that that pursued these policies. So it's not just a few cities that you've heard of, Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen doing this. It's all over China. And that is true for robotics, for EVs. By the way, EVs, there were 80 cities doing EV, more than 300 brands. You can say that is a problem. But in terms of actual visible success, the localities have, the local governments have played a critical role. And I'll come back to the downsides in a little bit. But this has worked, especially for new sectors. And this is rolling out in AI, in quantum. Many different cities that you've never heard of with 5 million people are doing global quantum. 5 million, by the way, is a very, very small city in China's terms, are doing global technological work that is impressive. I just want to share a little anecdote. It's not that the local governments are only helpful to these private companies on the way up. They're also very, very helpful on the way down, when they have problems. And why? Very simple to understand. They care about the employment. The company is employing thousands of people. They care about the tax revenue that this company is producing. They work tirelessly for them. I have seen this firsthand. They would get calls they would call at 11 p.m., the entrepreneur and the founder, to help them sort out some coordination issues. They have no weekends. The district chief in Hangzhou, whom I've seen, the district chief in one district, a part of Hangzhou, has no weekends. One of my friends, entrepreneurs, told me in his Jiaxing locality, can you call it a city? It's not even it's a district. Said one morning he got a call from the district chief saying, yesterday, I saw that your energy usage, electricity usage dropped by 15%. I'm really worried. Is everything okay? I mean, so they would be monitoring the activities of all their companies in the locality, worrying for them over things that even they don't worry themselves. This is not a communist party that you read in the West that is trying to choke the private sector and trying to steal and extrapolate and expropriate. I'm sorry, this is really the opposite. And if the world cannot be more attuned to the realities of China, they'll always get it wrong, and it's becoming very dangerous. Now, I'm not saying that this is true for every single district in every single city in all of China. There are tens of thousands of these cities and districts and so forth. But this is not an uncommon phenomenon. In all parts of Guangzhou, Beijing, Shanghai, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, eastern provinces, coastal provinces, this is a very, very common pattern. So this misconception is a deep one, but it also highlights that this model has worked if you measure it in terms of success. But now let me tell you a little bit about the downside as well. And here it comes to the resilience and robustness and sustainability issue. Of course, there are significant downsides, right? The question is, we just don't really know what the cost is compared to the benefits. But if you look at the localities and local governments, the amount of debt that has been a core issue of the Chinese economy is very much in line with how the model works. The local government officials would like to borrow as much as possible to develop their economy, whether it's real estate or property, or give them land. And by the way, Tesla got very cheap land, lots of cash, and was heavily subsidized by the Shanghainese government to build its gigafactory. That creates debt issues. Fiscal sustainability issues. And then there's the overcapacity issue. And then there's a too much competition issue, right? Does China really need 300 or 80 cities to all do their own EV brand? No, they don't, right? And they don't need it for solar panels and so forth. Of course, the only thing I would say is that the industrial policy à la chinoise that has worked is that ultimately it has led to more competition, not less. Many of the industrial policies leads to less competition. They build, nurture giants and national champions and lead to more monopolies. It's the opposite in China. It has led to more competition. And competition is generally a good thing unless there's too much of it. In China, it is the case that there's too much of it. But there will be and now going forward, there will be a period of consolidation. China's 5-year plan going forward is less about producing more and more and more, something that shocks the world, but more about efficiency. Scaling back and talking more about and less about quantity and quality. How do the parts work together rather than build out more data centers? How do they actually connect and make it more efficient across the nation? How do the EVs plug into the ecosystem and make it more efficient? It's going to be less about scale and numbers and more about efficiency gains. And that is directly to tackle the hyper competition that the Chinese economy has seen, in part because of the local economy. And I know that there's very limited time. I'm supposed to speak only for 20 minutes. So I'll probably conclude with this new model. My view, although I'm Western trained economist, I've done all the models and I write Western style economic models. I still believe that China has fostered something very different. This is why in my book I call it Beyond Socialism and Capitalism. It is something that we need to all deeply think about, especially in advanced parts of the world, as there are deep fallacies to our capitalistic system. There are deep fallacies to the Chinese model as well, but we cannot and we should no longer argue that there is only one model of development that works, because China has proven it to be the contrary. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Keyu, for this overview of what has been achieved in China. And in fact, I remember when the Millennium Development Goals were announced to cut poverty, I don't know, by half. I mean, all those goals by 2015, those who were achieved thanks to China and its massive success in reducing poverty. So that is also a little bit an untold story. But of course, the question remains: there is the West Coast, the East Coast, which is prospering, and there are some very interesting economic ecosystems emerging in the West. But where do you, I mean, in terms of rural-urban gap, do you think this has been successfully addressed? I mean, that's also the link to Switzerland. You said, yeah, China has probably one of the most decentralized economic ecosystems. I would argue Switzerland has it too. But but I also agree that a small, tiny country like Switzerland cannot be governed in the same way like a large country like China. But is there, because we discussed it also in the panel before, some Swiss companies went to China when it came to as consultants, when it came to water cleaning stations, and they were so much impressed how quickly these things were then implemented, thanks also to top-down decisions, because there were urgent needs to be addressed and so on. But you mentioned this collaborative culture. Do you see between Switzerland and China this that there are synergies, or is it? How do you compare the two systems?
You mentioned the urban-rural gap. It is the biggest source of income inequality and inequality in general in China, whether it's access to infrastructure, social infrastructure, schooling, healthcare, etc. And this is also due to some of the particular features of the Chinese economy and Chinese politics, which is the restriction of large migration across the different provinces. And without human capital flows, without flows of many kinds, capital and so forth, that income inequality is still a very lingering issue. Our president cares very much about the rural areas because that's where he started out his career and that's where his heart lies. But I haven't seen a very concerted project to lift these people out of poverty and they are out of poverty, but really into real prosperity, unless these migration flow restrictions are tackled. However, it would be an interesting experiment because the Chinese government is debating as to whether you allow these migrations into big cities or actually build cities around their locality. So have satellite cities, and it will be around a satellite city where there will be more migration flows. All of that could reduce the inequality. But again, I agree that this is one of the issues they have not addressed. But speaking of that, the extreme gap, right? The extremity of the welfare divergence in America lately is just really shocking. The cost of living for the lower income classes, lower income brackets, compared to the rich, and this is an entirely different issue, right? This is caused by an entirely different issue. It's not a rural-urban gap, but it is something that is very different that I find very interesting. In that sense, the Chinese people don't have that, right? The cost of living is low, it's affordable, but the prospects can be debated. Now, on your question regarding Switzerland and China, look, China wants to make as many friends as possible, and especially when it comes to the West. I think it admires countries like Switzerland for its organization, its a legal structure, its standing in the world, what it stands for in the world. We have to remember that China is still very much a player in the global economy, and it wants to stay there. Unlike some other countries in the world, it wants to firmly hold on to this global embedded network and be the most connected component. And there are, not just leaving aside the Swiss mega companies that do so well. And of course, Switzerland plays an outsized role compared to its country size. The fact that there's interconnection linkages between China and Europe with countries that are respected, like Switzerland, is a very important thing. And I just want to say that China is very open-minded when it comes to building these bridges, so long as the other side is also open-minded. And we've seen that in the COVID years, how that has really changed. But again, thanks to Trump, things are getting a lot warmer for China when it comes to Europe.
Thanks a lot. So I suggest we open up the forum for questions also. Yeah, over there.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the interesting presentation. Jonas Hiller here from the Tony Pirch Foundation. So I was about 9 years ago at the Tsinghua University at the School of Environment. And back in that day, there was basically the issue of you have centralized policy and then you have a decentralized economy in these like basically smaller districts. And then because the way politicians or decision makers get promoted is through economic growth, that they have to keep certain GDP growth rates in these areas that, for example, environmental regulations don't get implemented because there's kind of like your main priority is hitting these economic goals, and then the rest is kind of like a race to the bottom when it comes to environmental issues. I wonder, like, because I've been there 9 years ago, so it might be really different. Did you get any information on that, or do you have anything? Thank you.
I think it's still very much similar, right? The problems the whole political agenda is still similar, especially when the economy is now weaker than it was before 9 years ago. The emphasis is now replaced on economic development, GDP growth. But again, I think what is mainly different between now and 9 years ago is that they place much, much more emphasis on high tech and hard tech. And local governments do well there, they will be rewarded even more so. And if you look at the amount of disproportionate funding apportioned to hard tech and high tech nationally, and how much they mobilize social capital around it, it is very clear that China is going in a very divergent path where a lot less emphasis is put on real estate, clearly, less emphasis on consumption, not consumption per se, but consumption-oriented companies. It's just not part of what the nation or the leadership believes is the main driver and savior of the Chinese country and the nation. It has to be hard tech and high tech. I think that is the main difference. But of course, competition has increased over time dramatically, even compared to 9 years ago. And this is why the Chinese companies all want to go global. That might not look like it's good news for the rest of the world. But I think they're also coming to understand that if they do decide to go global, it will have to be a two-way street, and that they will have to invest heavily in the local capabilities, skills, technologies, investment, employment, et cetera, et cetera. This is something that is still very much being trialed out. It's a learning by doing. But competition in the last few years in particular has gone up even more because the economy has gone down and there's less demand.
There is a question. Sorry.
Yes, thank you. Good morning or good afternoon. Extremely fascinating remarks that you gave. My name is Eleni Gebremedhin. I'm currently at Georgetown University Business School. I visited Wenzhou about 20 years ago on a study trip around rural industrialization. And we were struck by how this model, and I 100% agree with you, and I was based in Ethiopia at the time and was with the Ethiopian delegation. We went back talking really about exactly what you said, that there's this political centralization, but so much decentralization and encouragement of ideas and innovation on the economic side. So that was very interesting to hear from you on that. But anyway, back to the Wenzhou model, one of the things that really struck us was the extent of specialization that was being pushed. So Wenzhou happened to be the place where 80% of the world's lighters were manufactured. And I don't know the percentage, but a very high percentage of shoes. And this was something that farmers had been transitioning into, industry, but in this very specialized way. And another model that we looked at was the one village, one product. So again, having, a specialization on a industrial product that was really sort of promoted by location, which leads to clustering, positive externalities. There's a lot of people doing the same thing in one place, so they learn from each other. So now, when I heard you this morning talking about the hyper competition on tech, it struck me that maybe this was no longer the policy when it came to tech, that everybody was doing EV all, across the country in the same way, rather than having one area doing one type of tech and another place doing another type of solar or EV. So I guess my question is there that nuance in the tech rollout of technology or high tech or DeepSeek or all of it? To what extent could hyper competition be addressed by going back to that, specialized industrialization model that we saw? Thank you.
Thank you. It is a very sharp observation that you made, and it is something that I think it deserves a lot more careful thinking. But first of all, I would say that when it comes to technology, the proximity of the supply chain matters, right? When you're an EV, you want the manufacturers, the battery makers, control systems. There's something about being close by within a province, first of all, that makes it easier to control, manage, and coordinate. Whereas the traditional goods, where the supply chains are spread over potentially around the world, I think there's a difference. Potentially, there's a difference between that. And, if you look at the semiconductors, I remember the case in Japan, 1980s. The reason that they advanced so much, part of the reason was the proximity of the end users, like the electronics sector, with the semiconductors companies, and they had a very fast feedback loop, and that was very helpful. And I do know from experience that that fast cycle or the comprehensiveness of the supply chain, especially when it comes to leading edge technology, is something that China also has an advantage, over other countries, and maybe that partly explains the rapid pace of the success, but also because of local. In complex sectors like high tech that requires a lot of coordination, a lot of management, I believe that having a lot of that within a province is potentially rewarding, and I think that could be part of that. But even there is some specialization. So, for instance, within Jiangsu province, but again, they're not far away, right? One city would be focusing on one area of semiconductors, storage. Another would be focusing on another part, also so as to distinguish themselves, right? And also to have some of the clustering. That is still very much still true. However, when it comes with also another difference is that because there's been so much emphasis on hard tech, this is a survival issue, right? Not just about selling more widgets and more, cigarette lighters. It's about survival. The Chinese government has encouraged many different players to all try out, right? It's something where you cast the net wide and only a few could succeed. Whereas if you just say, okay, only one or two people does this, so these are very interesting questions. I think, I'm trying to get my head around this model as well. But EVs, when it first started, who knows who was going to succeed, right? So they let many, many different cities try out. And then over the course of the development, there will be more consolidation. And China is in the consolidation age right now. So all these city governments or provincial governments wanted to have a national champion, and they all tried out simultaneously. I think these are the reasons that explains this specialization. And I think there's really something to it, where complex high tech requires a lot more coordination and potentially cannot be globally spread out as much as the other more traditional manufacturing processes. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. We have about 2 or 3 minutes, maybe a last question. I mean, the interesting thing is Swiss foreign direct investment in China. I mean, we have someone from Bühler Group here, also having a large production plant there. I mean, maybe Ian Roberts, is there something? What is your experience as a Swiss company in China?
Well, thank you for requesting the question. Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. Yeah, I mean, Bühler went into China, I think, in 1982. We built up our operations in Wuxi. We now have operations across the country. Domestically, as a market, it's very important for us. It's a little harder now to export from China into certain areas. I've been utterly struck. I mean, I think the biggest change I saw was before and after COVID. When I left a country that was on a good pathway of technology development, and I go a couple of times a year usually, because we have big innovation teams in China as well. And I landed in a totally digitalized nation. And it was a staggering transformation. And now if I look, I can only echo what you say about AI. I think we need to stop now looking at China as a place where we go and do business. And we need to look at China as a place where we learn how to innovate faster, cheaper. We learn how to scale. I mean, how do you scale software with a few million people? A really good test of an app, 50 million people. This limits us in terms of our innovation power here. So I think this is fantastic. What I see in biotech now, Chinese companies building plants in Europe for leading pharma companies. This was unimaginable 10 years ago. And this knowledge that's been built up is extraordinary. I walked into one university around biotech. I saw more bioreactors in one space than I'd seen in the previous year across European and American universities. In one lab. So in the end, scale matters. So I would only say, I mean, I can only, I think, echo many of your observations in your speech with much less knowledge and much less depth. But what I see is China becomes an innovation force. And the mechanisms behind it are important to understand. But the key thing for businesses is to really understand, do we want to harness the innovation power of China to propel our businesses further? Or do we close down and think small and stay European? And then I don't think the future looks too bright.
Thanks a lot.
Excellent.
Maybe a final remark, and then we will all go for lunch probably. So, Keyu, what is your final remark?
Oh no, it's been a huge pleasure, and also just to listen to the last comments to put real observations grounded in reality. I really learned a lot from that as well. I think the last observation, I think what you just said was absolutely right. Before the Western countries and the people came and they taught China something, and China was a very eager learner, right? Very eager to learn the ways of the West. Now the table has flipped. I mean, when I was writing my book, starting in the 2019, the discussion was still about Chinese demanding technology transfers. Well, a few years later, they're ready to share their technology, or it's the other way around, transfer technology into Europe or other places. But I think, given that, I just want to say that another big misunderstanding is that the Chinese are really competitive. It's true. They are ferocious. It's true. But they live, our society and our philosophy is still based around some sort of harmony, right? Some sort of, not one against another, some kind of, practical, harmonious way of getting along. And they will remain open-minded. There's a lot of scope for discussion. You can ask the Chinese for things, I promise you, but paying them due respect, not challenging them in ways that are not really helpful. And And there's a lot of scope for collaboration because actually that's what they want. It's not driving out others, but the open-mindedness that they want to be firmly embedded with Europe, with a global supply chain, not an isolationist mentality or a Chinese version of MAGA at all exist for China. So I think with that backdrop, I hope that there will be a lot more potential collaborative projects between Europe and China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was,